Going to start a new book called The Swiss Reformation. This is by Bruce Gordon, roughly 350 pages, though it's quite a small font. This was written in 2002. A couple decades back, Bruce Gordon, I read a book of his biographical account of Calvin, which is certainly worth reading. Enjoyed it quite a lot. I like his writing. We'll start with the introduction today, and then we'll progressively make our way through the Swiss Reformation. This is the introduction. The Swiss Reformation is a peculiar subject. The name itself is easily deconstructed with the recognition that the Swiss Confederation was not a state, but a collection of semi-autonomous lands bound together by alliances, language, culture, and history. Indeed, the very term Swiss implies an artificial unity. At every turn, the Confederation defies generalizations, and the historians of religious change in the 16th century must consider each region individually. My intention in this book is to present a view of the Swiss Reformation in English, which is attentive both to the historical developments which shaped the Confederation and the localities in that union. At the same time, there's a central narrative constructed around the pivotal roles played by Huldrych Zwingli and Heinrich Bullinger. And this is an account of the Reformed Reformation. The Catholic Reformation in the Swiss Confederation is a fascinating and complex subject which requires its own full-length study. Indeed, this examination of the Protestant Reformation has been delineated. I've chosen to end the story in 1566 with the appearance of the Second Helvetic Confession, the fullest statement of Swiss Reformed thought. The Swiss Reformation has occupied a curious place in the historiography of the European Reformation. By and large, it has been treated as the story of Huldrych Zwingli, although there has been considerable interest in Anabaptism. English historians are increasingly sensitive to the importance of the churches of Zurich and Basel to the development of Protestantism, especially under Edward VI, but also under Elizabeth I. However, linguistic barriers, as well as the dearth of scholarship on the important aspects of the Swiss Reformation, have continued to obscure many points of contact. In Germany and the United States, the continuing fascination with Luther has kept the Swiss Reformation on the periphery. Zwingli generally makes an appearance in the role of Luther's theological foil, especially regarding the Lord's Supper. The bitter divide between Luther and Zwingli has continued to cast its shadow on Reformation scholarship. There have been some notable exceptions, and the work of these scholars is to be found in the bibliographical essay. The prominence of Zwingli owes a great deal to a decision made by the Zwingli Verein in Zurich at the end of the 19th century to commit itself to producing an edition of the works of Zwingli and not Bullinger. During the 100 years it took for the critical edition of Zwingli's principal theological works to be completed, Bullinger virtually disappeared from Reformation scholarship. I can't remember if it's pronounced Bullinger or Bullinger. I'll get it right eventually, I promise. Sporadic efforts have been made to produce critical editions of some of his writings, but these remain largely individual initiatives. The Institute for Swiss Reformation History in Zurich is seeking to make more of Bullinger's writing available, but a full critical edition does not appear in sight. While most of Bullinger's theological and historical works remains inaccessible, his correspondence is being edited and published by the excellent team of Hans Ulrich Bachtold, Rainer Heinrich, and Kurt Rutschi. The task is daunting, but the results are remarkable, revealing the breadth and depth of Bullinger's European connections. The gradual appearance of these letters continue to throw light on the darkened landscape of the post-1531 Swiss Reformation. Situation of the other Swiss reformers is even less encouraging. The works of Vadianus, reformer in St. Gall, has been edited, but for most of the reformers of Basel, Bern, Schaffhausen, and even Zurich, there's little available. In the early part of the 20th century, fired by the enthusiasm generated by the 400th anniversaries of the Swiss Reformation, scholars such as Emil Egli, Rudolf Steck, Gustav Tabler, and Ernst Stalin produced volumes of edited documents, but in almost every case they stopped in the year 1532. These editions have proved invaluable repositories for scholars, but they also perpetuated the idea that the Swiss Reformation lasted from 1519 to 1532. The subject does not have a mature historiography, and much of the type of work now being done, as well as the work which desperately needs to be done, was covered many years ago for other parts of Europe. If this book helps to direct scholars towards new research in the field, it will have achieved one of its primary goals. This book takes a long view of the Swiss Reformation. The first chapter examines the historical development of the Confederation. Although a sketch, the chapter attempts to convey the uneven development of the Confederation, to outline crucial events, and to discuss its culture. The second chapter deals with Zwingli and the Reformation in Zurich. The emphasis on Zurich reflects the central contention of this book that Zwingli was key to the Swiss Reformation. The third chapter looks at the expansion of the Reform movement beyond Zurich, though the role of Zurich continues to be emphasized. Prominent themes which emerge include the importance of networks, the common background of the Reformers, in particular the University of Basel, preaching, and relations with the ruling authorities. This book argues for the power of personalities in Reform movements by examining how certain individuals were able to marry a persuasive articulation of evangelical views with local aspirations and resentments. The evangelical movement was always in a minority position. It never became a mass movement, but that was not necessary. As Zwingli demonstrated in Zurich, reform could be brought about without the active participation of the majority of the people. Chapter 4 deals with the crucial years of 1529 to 1536, following the high point of the Zwinglian Reformation, the disputation at Bern, through the disaster of the Second Capelle War, and its resolution. The collapse demonstrated both the fragility and success of the Reformation. The catastrophe was precipitated when Zwingli, desperate for a breakthrough and too reliant on the alliances he had sought, reached too far. He had established the Reformation in Zurich on the basis of his prophetic authority. This was underpinned by personal relations between Zwingli and leaders in Zurich, such as the Burgermeisters, Royst, and Lavater, on the one hand, and the sodality of friends, men like Leo Judd and Caspar Megander on the other. This web of relations, while able to bring about reform, was not strong enough to pull against the traditions of the Confederation. And when Zurich attempted to cajole the rural areas and then its reluctant allies into a war against the Catholic Confederates, disaster ensued. Chapter 5 looks at the recovery from Kappel and the rebuilding of the Swiss Reformed churches. The fraught issues of relations with German Lutherans is central to the discussion. The chapter also examines the last expansion of the Reformed churches into the French-speaking lands of the Pays des Vaudes, and this naturally raises the question of the role of Calvin and Geneva. This book does not attempt to cover Geneva except as the city related to the developments in the Confederation. There are a couple of reasons for this decision. First, the literature available on Calvin and Geneva in English is so extensive that no purpose would be served by yet another brief overview. Second, Geneva was not officially part of the Swiss Confederation, though not for want of trying. Chapter 5 marks the end of the chronological study of the Swiss Reformation, and I've decided to end the story with the Second Helvetic Confession in 1566. Not only was the confession the fullest expression of the Swiss Reformed theology, but it also marked a turning point. Although Bullinger would live for another 9 years, the theological and religious climate was changing. The principal reformers of the Swiss Reformation who had known Zwingli or emerged in the period after Kappel had died, and the new generation increasingly looked to Geneva and the so-called Calvinist orthodoxy. The Swiss churches became part of an international reform community, but not as leaders. Having concluded the historical narrative, the book turns to examine the development of radicalism. This concerns not only the rise of Anabaptism, but also powerful strands of spiritualism which emerged out of the Swiss Reformation. The book argues that Zwingli's attack on what he saw to be the materialistic nature of the late medieval religion and his profound attachment to a Pauline view of the primacy of the spirit attracted a wide range of figures who, drawing on late medieval mysticism and the spirituality of the Devotio Moderna, looked to an immediate relationship with God. Zwinglian theology had at its core a radical message which was variously appropriated. Chapter 7 attempts to provide a sense of church life in the Reformation by looking at parish structures, the role of the minister, church discipline, worship. And while Chapter 8 looks at the range of contemporary sources to illustrate Swiss society in the 16th century, briefly considering issues such as weather, economic conditions, the place of women, and death. Both of these chapters are necessarily impressionistic in order to convey something of what the Reformed churches look like and the mental and physical world in which the Reformation took place. The last two chapters of the book open up to the subject and consider its international implications. Chapter 9 looks at the role of the Swiss churches in the wider European Reformation, both as a powerful influence and as a refuge. The survey highlights southern Germany, England, and Eastern Europe. The Confederation had no political or military influence, apart from mercenaries. Its Reformation was spread by personal contacts and the printed word. Swiss influence was never exclusive, formed one strand in the complex evolution of local reform movements, but the breadth of its dissemination and the density of contacts illustrates the central place occupied by the Swiss reformers. This theme is taken up in a final chapter on the enduring significance of the Swiss Reformation, which argues that the legacy resides in the remarkable intellectual achievements of the period. The powerful conjunction of Erasmian humanism with evangelical thought brought about a cultural and intellectual explosion in the half-century following the introduction of the Reformation. During this time, a remarkable collection of figures, many of whom were foreigners, lived, worked, and wrote in the Confederation. They defined the profile of Reformed theology and expanded their range of intellectual inquiry to printing, natural science, bibliography, geography, history, and medicine. In order to give an impression of the vast array of achievements and the richness of this intellectual world, the book offers a series of portraits of some of the leading figures. From the complex story, there are certain key themes which the reader should bear in mind. The Swiss Confederation was a curious development of the late Middle Ages, an association of upland communities and city-states governed by the need for mutual protection and resolute self-interest. It is hard to speak of a Swiss identity, but there was a recognition that a dissolution of the Confederation would disadvantage all the members. The strength and weakness of the Reformation was Zwingli's close association with Zurich. It both made the events of the 1520s possible and precluded the fulfillment of Zwingli's dream of refashioning the Swiss Confederation as a religious league of reformed states. This vision failed because of the old enmities towards Zurich and the unwillingness of Bern, in particular, to resign its own strategic priorities. The key figure after Zwingli was Heinrich Bullinger, who used his unique authority in Zurich to propagate a moderate Zwinglian reformism, a coherent and balanced theological vision of confederation of reformed states, which were often in conflict and they lacked a collective sense of purpose. The intellectual energy of the Swiss Reformation, both of Erasmian humanism and evangelical thought, brought the Confederation into the forefront of Renaissance culture in the middle of the 16th century. For a period of time, the Swiss cities stood alongside the leading cultural centers of Europe. By the time Bullinger's death, however, this golden period was coming to an end. Finally, something needs to be said about the terminology adopted in this book. I have favored the name Swiss Confederation over the anachronistic Switzerland, which emerged in the 19th century. I also have preferred state or confederate to canton against a post-Napoleonic creation, or the translation for Ort. Religious labels are notoriously misleading, but I've chosen evangelical over Protestant, and I use radical for those who found Zwingli's reforms in theology too tepid. From the 1528 Bern Disputation, where the Swiss theology took shape, I use Reformed, although I also use Zwinglian to stress the centrality of Zurich in theological formulations. I am aware that all these terms are open to multiple interpretations, but I've tried to maintain consistency.